I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and today we're speaking with R.J. Cutler, a very accomplished documentary filmmaker. His latest is Belushi, about the infamous SNL performer, and it's currently available to view through Showtime. And the first question I want to ask is, how did you get access to these interviews that are heard in the film? And was getting the access the beginning of your wanting to make this documentary about John Belushi?
Well, it's a good question. It's kind of the central question of the of how the film came to be. I produced a film called "Listen to Me, Marlon" with a producing partner who was also my producing partner in this film, John Batzik, who is a tremendously accomplished documentary producer. And John and I were finishing that film and having lunch one day talking about what we might do together next. And he mentioned that for the better part of a decade, he had been pursuing the rights from Judy Belushi to make a film about John. And he asked if that might not be something that I would be interested in directing. And of course, I leapt at the opportunity because I was an enormous John Belushi fan. Saturday Night Live launched when I was, I think, 14 years old. And before Saturday Night Live, I had been an avid reader of the National Lampoon. And through the National Lampoon, I had discovered the National Lampoon Radio Hour. And through the Radio Hour, I had discovered John Belushi. So like so many of us, I felt like he was, my own. And I had a deep connection to him and his work and his life and his career, and suffered heartbreak with so many others when he died so young and tragically. And so I told John that I would leap at the opportunity to direct that film, and that I suspected it might be a good time for him to reapproach Judy, having Listen to Me, Marlon as an example of the kind of work we might do on a film about John Belushi. And sure enough, a few weeks later, John Batzik called me and said Judy would love us to come up to Martha's Vineyard to talk more to her about making a film about John. And we went up there. And while we were up there, we came across these tapes. And we found that in her personal archive, in the basement of her house on Martha's Vineyard, Judy Belushi had about 80 hours of audio tapes and some videotapes that were the results of an oral history that she had put together in the wake of Bob Woodward's publishing the book Wired, which Judy and so many others in John's life felt didn't accurately reflect who he was, certainly as a person and as an artist, that it focused principally on his addiction and not his addiction issues, but what it presented as kind of his overindulgent ways. And so she had put together this oral history, and all these tapes still existed. And also what existed were all these letters that John had written to her through his life. And while the archive was thin on footage and home photos and home film, it was very thick on these audio tapes that were made right in the wake of John's passing. And that was critical to me because even before we had gone to Martha's Vineyard, I had started having conversations with people who knew John, just off the record conversations, just to get a sense of the kind of thing that people had to say about him. And what I discovered was that people were kind of, the things they were telling me felt very ossified. They felt very kind of lost in the foggy haze of memory. They didn't have the immediate rawness that I was certain a film about John Belushi demanded. And then when I listened to these tapes that were made months and years right after his passing, and you hear from the closest people in his lives, you hear from his life, you hear from Dan Aykroyd, you hear from Lorne Michaels, you hear from Harold Ramis, you hear from Carrie Fisher, you hear so much from the people who he shared his life with. When I heard those tapes, I knew we had found our path into the film.
One of the really interesting pieces of this film is the use of animation that you use to detail several moments in John's life. And I'm curious as to what led you to decide on using that medium to demonstrate these aspects of his life.
Well, as I mentioned, there wasn't a lot of home footage of John. He was, but more importantly, I think for the sake of making a film, there wasn't even a lot of public footage of him. There was a lot of performance, but John was a private man, and you know, when you think about the time in which John Belushi was perhaps the most successful entertainer on the planet, with the number one late night television show, the number one film comedy in history, and the number one record album with a touring band all simultaneously. But when he was 29 years old, when you think of that and you think of that moment, you have to realize that it was a moment where celebrity was not a driving force in our culture yet. Saturday Night Live launches in 1975. People Magazine launches in 1974. Before 1974, People Magazine was a little column in Time Magazine that people would look at. You know, it was half a page. The world changed. Celebrities had private lives. Celebrities didn't go on speaking tours. Late night talk shows didn't promote films and television shows. They just, you know, Johnny Carson would book somebody who was interesting to talk to, and then he'd talk to them. It was a very different cultural moment. And so we don't have a lot of footage of John kind of pouring his heart out to an interviewer about his life. And we don't have, it was also not a social media moment, obviously, in the 1970s and before. So we don't have a lot of home movies. And John comes from an immigrant family, and they have a Super 8 camera, but there isn't much surviving footage from it. What are you going to do to tell the story, to fill in those gaps? How are you, even with, we did have some audio tape, but how as a filmmaker, I had to ask myself, can I bring John, young John, and then later John to life so that we can come to understand the man behind the performance? We can understand the heart and the soul of the man. We had his letters, but we needed more. And the answer to me came in the form of the great Robert Valley, the Oscar-nominated animator who provided the animation that filled in those gaps. And then the key kind of, you know, epiphany or breakthrough in the animation process was when he first showed me young John, the 3-year-old boy who goes knocking on his neighbor's doors, and when they open up, he'll perform for them in their living room. When I saw that kid, I said to Robert, you know what, that kid has to be present throughout the film. We need to find a way when John opens the refrigerator, you know, in Chicago, when he's crashing some stranger's house, that kid arrives. When he's getting mad at an interviewer for prying into his private life and comparing him to Lou Costello, I want to see that little kid. When he's in the Chateau Marmont towards the end of his life, I want to see that little kid. And that really helped tie John throughout his life to who he was at his core.
My apologies there. One other thing I'm curious about is one of the interesting choices you made in this movie is when we hear what's written in these letters recited. The Belushi letters are read by a fellow SNL alum, Bill Hader, who's probably who I think has this versatileness that was also within Belushi, who could do so much more. Is often just thought of in terms of comedy, but could do so much more than that. How did you come to use him as the voice of Belushi in these letters?
You know, I knew I wanted somebody to read them. The letters are a hugely significant part of the film, and they reveal the essence of John, and they also are the most confessional aspect of the film. They're also the aspect of the film that brings the love story between John and Judy to life from John's point of view. So they couldn't have been more central to what I was hoping to accomplish. And I knew that we had to have somebody read them. And Bill Hader was my first thought. And I can't even, it's almost a pre-conscious thought. I was like, we should ask Bill Hader. and we did. And as Bill explained it to me, when his agent called and told them that he had been offered this gig, he said yes. He didn't ask to see the film or see a cut or read the letters. He just said yes. And I said, why? And he said, well, what choice did I have, really? And I get it. And it made me think. It's hard to imagine that any performer goes through a life as a cast member on Saturday Night Live and doesn't think long and hard about John Belushi and their connection to John Belushi, and what one might call their indebtedness to John Belushi or their relationship to John Belushi as an artist performing, as part of the ensemble that really he created. Because that's another thing about the film that's so, I think, important and revelatory, is that there's no question that Lorne Michaels created Saturday Night Live. There's no question that Lorne Michaels has sustained Saturday Night Live for decades in an astounding way. But it was John Belushi who first assembled that company of performers that defined what the Not Ready for Primetime Players was. And he assembled them both in his personal life and his professional life over several years around the National Lampoon Radio Hour. That's his company that lives to this day.
So I'm just curious about, so you said you were 14 when SNL premiered in 1975.
Yeah.
I know that my mom remembers watching it. When it first came on, it became appointment television.
Sure.
Which is so weird to think of, it's something being on Saturday night, being appointment
That's
television. Right. Do you have a personal favorite Belushi moment from SNL? I know there's a lot to choose from, but do you have a personal favorite?
It's actually hard to say, but I remember a series of mind-blowing incidents that culminated in the Blues Brothers coming out and performing, and Paul Schaefer kind of playing Ron Delsner and doing. Ron Delsner used to host a late night rock and roll show that was on like Friday nights at midnight or something, and Paul Schaefer with his collar open and his chains, very 1970s, rock and roll impresario, came out, and he said, and was a cold open on an episode of Saturday Night Live.
I know which episode you're talking about, actually.
Yeah, and he introduced the Blues Brothers. Nobody knew what. Listen, we try to capture this. I think we succeed in capturing this at the very open of the documentary of the film. It's you see their performance at the Universal Amphitheater. I saw their first performance on Saturday Night Live, and there are selections from the performance that you see them on stage at Saturday Night Live from that episode. But the essence of it was that nobody knew what it was. It was like performance art a full decade before performance art existed. It was comedy and music and mind-blowing and performance, and you couldn't even contextualize it. The characters were fictional, but they were real. So it was very exciting. It was thrilling, especially for a kid. I was probably 16 at the time when the Blues Brothers first appeared. So that was a big thing that I remember. But there's more that I recall from those years that I think those of us, and I bet your mom, who loved watching Saturday Night Live and loved watching John Belushi, shared, which was I think we all felt a connection to him in a way that's different than the relationship that you normally have with a performer. Chevy Chase made us laugh. He was doing slapstick. Dan Aykroyd was the wise guy's wise guy, and you love that. And Bill Murray satirized the entertainment world in a way that you really appreciate. And you really responded to those guys. Gilda was unbelievable and versatile and hilarious, and the writing was so brilliant. And there was so much. Everybody was interesting and exciting in their own ways. I'm leaving people out, but trust me, everybody delivered. But John, you felt you knew. John, you found yourself thinking about him when the show wasn't on the air. You found yourself wondering about him when the show wasn't. You were curious about his life off screen, and you didn't even know what that meant. And that is what was special about John Belushi. He connected to you. You know, Lauren says you could see into, or maybe it's John Landis who says you could see into his soul. You could see somehow you could understand his thought process. I think they're describing the same thing that I'm talking about. But for a kid on Long Island watching this, 15, 16 years old, thinking, what's it like after the show? What's John Belushi up to now? It was an unusual way to connect to an artist. And it was very meaningful.
I think one of the great surprises of the movie comes towards the very end, and I mean the very end. Which, if you haven't watched the movie, when you watch it, watch the credits the full way through, because at the end there's this, there's great music throughout, because John lived at the time when I think rock and roll achieved perfection, and but at the end there's this incredible, very serene song that kind of feels out of place at first, but then then when I saw the song credits, I realized that it was an original song by Judith Belushi Pisano. And I'm curious as to, how did the song's use in the film come about?
Well, thank you so much for asking. You know, I haven't been asked a lot about it, and I'm I'm grateful to you for bringing it up. And it's one of those happy accidents, you know. Judy, the only contemporary interview I did in the making of this film was with Judy Belushi. She was the only person I sat down with and interviewed myself. Everything else we got from the oral history archives, for the reasons that I explained before. But with Judy, I knew I just had so much to talk to her about. And in fact, when she first invited us up to Martha's Vineyard, off camera, off mic, she and I spent a couple of days just walking around the island and sitting on the cliff that overlooks the ocean that you see in the film at John and Judy's old house that Jim Belushi now lives in, and talking about her life and her life with John and their lives together and John's life. And it's how I got to know her, and it formed the foundation for me of the stories that I would tell in the film. And it made me certain that I wanted to interview Judy over the course of making the film, and I did multiple times. And it wasn't easy for her. These are memories that are often very painful, and they're memories that go back many decades. But she brought it. She brought it every time, and she came to Los Angeles and sat for these interviews, and we did them as audio interviews because I knew that I wasn't putting people on camera. But for the final interview that I did with her, I thought, you know what, we should put her on camera just in case. Who knows how we're going to feel in the editing process? Maybe I'll find a moment where she, and I thought it might. And that concept went out the window very quickly. I didn't want to put her on camera. But while we were filming, she said to me, you want to know what I've been doing lately? And I was like, sure. She said, well, I've been writing a lot of music, and I brought my ukulele. And I was like, oh, have ya and did ya? And she said, yes. And I said, mind if we film? And she said, I'd be delighted. And she played a couple of songs. And one of the songs was the story of her life and her life with John. And that's the song that you hear in the film. And it's not a literal presentation of her life with John. It's not a literal presentation of her life story, but it is a poetic, musical honoring of her life and her life story with a little bit of distance. And it's very beautiful. And when we put it over the credits, I realized it was, that's where it wanted to belong, and that's where it did belong. And so that's where it is.
RJ, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you all the best over these next couple of months. And to all of our viewers, please like this video, smash that subscribe button, and don't forget to go to goldderby.com and use the Gold Derby app to make your predictions and see if you can outsmart the top prognosticators in Hollywood. Thanks so much, RJ.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.